City are navigating waters they haven't charted in nearly 20 years. 2006 was the last time City lost 4 games in a row. 2016 was the last time City conceded 4 goals in a Champions League game. This is the first time Guardiola has lost 4 games in a row in his managerial career. They've already conceded 5 or more non-penalty big chances in 3 of their first 11 league games this season. Compared to the past 5 years, that beats their highest total for an entire league season. Across those Premier League games, City have conceded the opening goal 5 times. Keep watching as I'm going to break down why City have struggled relative to their absurdly high standards. If this is just a short-term blip caused by injuries, how the squad building and Pep's team selections are compounding the issues, and whether these issues can be resolved this season, or whether Man City are just broken. Now, it would be impossible to overlook the Ballon d'Or-sized elephant in the room, the injury to Rodri. But the challenges facing City this season go beyond his absence, and the starting point should be Guardiola's structural shift this season. Since August, Pep has, as always, evolved his system, moving away from last season's 2-3-5 to a 3-1-6 in possession, with Rico Lewis pushing forward right back into the attack. We saw how effective this was in the season opener against Chelsea, where City were able to manipulate Chelsea's increasingly popular 4-2-4 off-ball structure. But even back then, I raised concerns about the structural weaknesses this approach could expose. A 3-1 setup inherently has fewer players supporting rest defence than a 3-2 or a 2-3, which means you're down from 5 players to 4 when the ball turns over. The forward 6 in the 3-1-6 can overwhelm an opponent's back line, but given City have become so easy to play through, I'd argue that trade-off isn't worth it. Even if Rodri were available, he'd still be left isolated as that one in midfield, facing the same daunting task of covering too much space alone. Last season, Rodri often found himself stretched to his limit on an island. Now, with Lewis advancing higher up the pitch, those vulnerabilities have only increased. As with Walker's forward positioning last season, there is so much ground for Lewis to cover in transition, but it's arguably a greater defensive weakness than last season, given the disparity in pace between Walker and Lewis. So, there are parallels with last season, and there were problems last season, but City still managed to win the title. It was never as bad as this, and of course, at least Rodri was there. Without him, City are far worse on the ball. They find it more difficult to play out of danger. They find it harder to link the midfield to the attack. They miss his creativity and goal threat. But as evidenced this season, the biggest issue is vulnerability to counterattacks and a general weakness defensively. Why are City so frail in this aspect of the game? Well, Pep's biggest weakness has always been and will always be opposition counterattacks. But there's one thing to be vulnerable and another to be hopeless. Without Rodri, the midfield has a severe lack of physicality and duel winning, whether in the air or on the ground. In addition, when the central options have been Kovacic, Gundogan, Bernardo Silva, and Lewis, there is little to no recovery pace, but plenty of poor mobility. That is a recipe for a poor counter-press and a poor general press. What's so confusing about this, however, is that City are playing as if Rodri is in the team, as if there are no physical limitations. Outside of the Southampton game, where City seemingly made more of a conscious effort to retreat and defend rather than aggressively press, the pressing philosophy has remained unchanged. Every action is just a little bit too late and not executed quickly enough. When bypassed, the City midfield has no chance of catching up to opposition forwards, turning 3-on-3s into 3-on-2s. Rodri was a player who could turn a 50-50 duel into a 70-30 in his favour. Now, that paradigm is reversed. Situations which in the past may have been deemed irrelevant are now constant battlegrounds. For example, one of my biggest footballing pet peeves is when a defender has plenty of time to cushion or direct an aerial ball to a teammate, or has time to bring it down, but instead opts to head it into midfield for a duel to be contested. Normally, that would be chalked off as a minor inconvenience, as Rodri simply contests it and either wins it himself or is enough of a nuisance for another City player to collect. Now, seemingly every time that happens, City lose possession and panic sets in. Opposition teams now know that, even if City do press them to force it long, there's an increased likelihood they'll win the ball back anyway due to that lack of height, that lack of aerial presence, duel winning, and physicality. Moreover, City's midfield now lacks consistent second ball winners who can sweep up and mitigate less predictable, dangerous moments. A 50-50 isn't a 50-50 anymore if you can't win your second balls. It just further compounds the frailty of the midfield and makes that midfield far easier to play against and bully. This data from Chunhang7 on Twitter illustrates the second ball problem perfectly. This is a list of City's second ball winners from last season. Rodri accumulated a staggering 76 second ball wins, 1.64 per 90. Look at the next closest midfielder, Kovacic. It's not a bad amount or per 90 ratio by any means, but it's not comparable to Rodri, who put the entirety of the midfield defensive burden on his back last season, supporting the team with these contributions. Speaking of backs and support, unreal segue that by the way, it's time to talk about the sponsor of today's video, FlexiSpot, and their C7 Air ergonomic office chair, which I'm sitting in right now. I've been using this chair for the past week and it's such a brilliant upgrade on my old chair, which didn't support my back well enough, it was clunky, and the headrest made my head hotter than that City performance against Bournemouth. The C7 Air, on the other hand, has everything I'd want in an office chair. My favourite feature is the dynamic lumbar pad, so my lower back is finally getting the support it needs. The material is a breathable mesh, so I don't overheat when I have all my lights on in my studio, and if I want to chill out and watch a game off stream, I can go full recline. Look at that. Basically, every single aspect of the chair you can adjust to your liking. As someone who works from home and spends hours upon hours sat in front of my computer and camera, I'm thankful I've now got a chair that's fit for purpose. Even my cat, who is fussy with furniture, likes sitting on it. FlexiSpot are currently offering huge discounts on their products as part of their Black Friday sale. So if you want to upgrade your seating experience, click the link in the video description. Thank you so much to FlexiSpot for sponsoring the video. Let's get back to it. The midfield problems I've outlined aren't a revelation, and Pep has remarked numerous times this season about the physicality of an opponent's midfield. So how has Pep compensated for the loss of Rodri? Perhaps, unsurprisingly, Pep has leaned further into the notion of supreme control and defending with the ball. After all, you can't concede goals from counterattacks if you don't concede counterattacks. And you can't concede counterattacks if you don't lose the ball. This explains why Pep has relied on Kovacic and Gundogan along with Lewis and Bernardo as his central options. The idea is one of compounding control. You want to retain possession and not lose it? Well, just play your best control-based midfielders who you'd associate with retention and control. That makes sense in theory, but in practice, this is a fool's errand. Pep is sacrificing everything in terms of counter-pressing and physicality for the idea of total control, even sacrificing creativity at times, but it's having the opposite of the desired effect. In part, this is because it's unreasonable to expect your players to achieve total control and authority in a game, even when misplaced passes occur in areas you don't associate with being dangerous. City are set up so poorly from a rest defense perspective and are so poor at counter-pressing that they can be exposed wherever they lose the ball. Whoever is playing Rodri's position also just isn't a natural six and isn't as good on the ball. They lack his pass selection, pass quality, and the position just inherently isn't second nature to them. More significantly, this opposite effect is happening because the midfield selections lack physicality, space eating, recovery pace, duel winning, height, and second ball winning. They get bullied off the ball far too easily, caught out continually. Therefore, control is lost too often. Rodri may not have brilliant recovery pace, but he at least had the duel winning, the steal. Was it perfect last season? No, but it was far more manageable. We are currently setting up in a manner which would be very difficult to succeed even with Rodri in the side. Now take him out of the side and replace him with players who can't hold a candle to him physically or defensively. This is why teams are finding it so easy to play through us. Our counter-pressing is pitiful. It's not for want of trying, it's more the case they simply can't do the job being asked of them. Kovacic wasn't signed to do this role, but he's having to do so given the failure in the summer to sign a player who could solve these midfield problems. And as the midfield suffers, so does the defence. Even the greatest back four in football history would struggle to perform to a high standard without the requisite support and protection of its midfield. But perhaps I'm overreacting. After all, we're only around 10 games into the season. City are very close to Liverpool and ahead of Arsenal. And we have a few players out with injuries. So is this all being blown out of proportion? Main reason I'd argue that no, this is a legitimate problem is because it's been a problem in basically every single game City have played this season, regardless of result. And as this continues, it becomes increasingly easy to imagine teams now viewing City as a team they can get at, one that has lost its fear factor to an extent. It's also a problem that won't be resolved from our injured players returning. Whilst I expect the offensive threat to improve with the returning De Bruyne and Bob, these players don't necessarily directly fix the defensive concerns. Now we'll get into what City can do in the winter transfer window to cure this issue. But in the interim, is there an in-house solution to treat the issue? There are potential short-term solutions utilising City's current available squad, which would hopefully platform and set City up for survival until the January window, where it can be addressed properly with a new signing. Let's firstly begin with the premise that Pep's not going to alter his current setup, and that Pep's going to continue to lean into pressing rather than retreating. No matter what we do here, that one is isolated by definition, but we can at least ease the burden on that one. So 3 centre-backs, and let's use Kovacic as the one. What's the in-house solution to give Kovacic some more support, to make us less easy to play through, to make us not completely useless in respect of counter-pressing? The most obvious answer is Matheus Nunes. From a physicality perspective, he has the attributes we need, particularly the recovery pace, which would help in both the counter-press and tracking back generally. He's far more physically imposing generally than a Kovacic or Gundogan, and I'd wager he'd also be superior from a dual winning and second ball perspective. He has been having great games at left wing, but we don't particularly need that pace out wide. We need it centrally, and we need it now. So why hasn't Pep played Nunes in the centre if seemingly it's such an obvious fix? Well, it might be as simple as Grealish and Doku have both been out, so that opportunity has never presented itself. But based on what we know Pep demands from his midfielders, I think there's a more fundamental issue at play. Because Pep clearly doesn't trust Nunes centrally. He's played there once this season, and that was against Watford in the League Cup. Even then, Pep raised concerns about his on-ball work. If Nunes loses the ball out wide or his touch fails him, it's not ideal, but it's very rarely detrimental. Conversely, lose the ball centrally in a 360-degree position, you're far more likely to suffer a dangerous counter-attack and concede big chances. The worst thing that could have happened in the defeat to Sporting was probably Nunes' error leading to the second penalty. Nunes wasn't even close to being one of the worst performers that day, but knowing how attention-specific Pep is, it wouldn't surprise me if he viewed that action as confirmation that Nunes isn't a central solution. And of course, Nunes isn't good enough on the ball to start for City in midfield in most circumstances. But for me, we've reached the point where it is irrelevant that Nunes is suspect on the ball. City's on-ball work and control is suspect now. At least with Nunes, you have the added benefit of his physicality, and it surely can't get worse from a false control perspective. Nico O'Reilly is another option for this role, given his physical attributes, and I'd like to see him given a go. But if we're being realistic, how likely is it Pep trusts him centrally in the most demanding area of the pitch. Going back to the lineup with Núñez centrally, the good thing about this team is that you can accommodate both Foden and De Bruyne in the midfield as well. We mustn't forget that's one of the reasons City won the title last season towards the end. It was because these two finally played centrally together. That midfield diamond stays the same in terms of shape, and in respect of placement, you could have De Bruyne at the tip or either side. For example, you could play him on the left of it, which would allow him to pick up those left wing positions as he did at the start of the season. The front three would then be a right winger, Haaland, obviously, and then Guardiola pushing up as he did last season to create the false winger effect of Foden starting on the left, but actually playing centrally. This allows Guardiola to better utilise his offensive skill set. He becomes more of a goal threat, arguably, and we saw last season how wonderful Foden and Guardiola were when they connected on that left side. This does, of course, raise an issue of Guardiola covering a lot of ground to get back, but that'll be the case regardless if we're sticking with the 3-1-6. You could even put Núñez on the left of the diamond to help counter-press and help Guardiola cover that space. That team works for me. Good wide defenders, the midfield now has some legs and physicality, I think everyone has been profiled well, and out of possession, it's as solid as it can be given the Rodri injury. Is Núñez a brilliant out-of-possession midfielder? Not based on his City career so far, but I'd contend this is far more stable and defensively sound than what we've seen thus far. It does also involve dropping Rico Lewis from right-back, which isn't fair, because he's been playing really well this season, but solidity needs to become more of a priority. The other option, which I might actually prefer, is to revert back to a 3-2 base and a box midfield. Now, Stones isn't reliable from an injury perspective, but I really think now could be a great time to trial Guardiola in the Stones role. I really think he could do it. It gives us an extra body at the back for rest defense and gives the midfield some physicality. The front five, you could then have a more conservative midfield and play just one of De Bruyne or Foden, or you can be less stable out of possession and play both, and that would allow for an actual left winger to start. An alternative is to drop Núñez alongside the 6 in that 2 ahead of the back 3, and then once again have Guardiola advance down the left side. No option is going to be perfect, but we don't need perfect. We just need to be within touching distance of the top of the table come January. Another alternative is to just amend the pressing structure and intensity. I wouldn't be against focusing on retreating rather than counter-pressing, and I wouldn't be against taking the pressing burden away from the centre and focus more so on the wide players having that responsibility. But failing that, I think the only in-house solution is to move Núñez centrally, promote someone like Nico O'Reilly, or go back to a 3-2 base. In January, for me, City must enter the market to win the title. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see an analysis video in the winter window where I offer some suggestions based on our current and future needs. Really hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to learn more about who I would have signed for City in the summer, check out this video next where I analysed 3 players which, in hindsight, would have solved all of the problems we've witnessed this season.